I haven't actually worked with Peter for 200 years, but we have actually worked together for 25 years. We started this journey exactly 25 years ago, and we come across, we do presentations all over the world now, and everybody thinks what we do is absolutely brand new. And it's been a privilege to work with Peter. He is an incredibly generous and an incredibly insightful person. He underplays himself. What Peter has done is remarkable because he's taken a concept, whether you call it resilience or emotional resilience or mental toughness, and he has been able to reduce it to 4 constructs or 4 ideas that are very accessible. And we're just about completing a piece of research that will allow us to expand that a little. So we know that mental toughness has got 8 components. So what Peter has done, quite remarkably, which people like Dweck and Seligman haven't really done, they've defined concepts, they've created concepts, and they've kind of said, well, this is what mindset's about. Peter has been able to describe quite simply and very succinctly what mental toughness is. And it's important. There are researchers all over the world. I mean, we now have more than 80 peer-reviewed published research papers which support Peter's model. Now that's quite unique. We have one person that Peter keeps talking about in Australia who tries to pick holes in what Peter does, but that's a good thing because it keeps you on your toes, and if the guy makes a point, Peter has to respond, and every time he does. But what we now understand is there is a concept called mental toughness. It's important, and this is what it consists of. Now, the work that Steve Oakes and I have been doing is all about operationalising it. So Peter is kind of the academic partner, but he's a very practical academic partner, which has been a big blessing for us. Our job has been able to take it out into the whole world. We now work in more than 80 countries. We work in every sector imaginable. Steve concentrates on your world, so we work in hundreds of schools, colleges, universities. My job is to take it out into the organisational world. I work with lots and lots of businesses. But although we kind of appear to do two different things, when it comes to mindset, we're doing exactly the same thing with exactly the same people. It's about working with people. Now, Peter threw up that funny little clip about University of Kansas. Remember that? And it just reminded me. You might have noticed that Peter's got an accent. Yeah? He's got a Yorkshire accent. Well, Peter and I were speaking at that conference. There were 600 people in a room. And pretty much like you, sorry, I'll backtrack a little. For once, I spoke first and Peter spoke second. Now, when you speak at a conference, you normally find that the audience, at least for the first few minutes, are quiet until they get bored. But usually they're quiet. I stood up and started speaking, and within 30 seconds, there was a real buzz going around the room, lots of people talking to each other, and I thought, what the hell's going on here? And then suddenly I heard a couple of people at the front say, hasn't he got a fantastic accent? And I realised they were picking up my English accent. So I stopped and said, how many people here think I've got a fantastic accent? 600 hands went up in the air. I said, if you think this is an accent, wait till you hear the next speaker. Anyway, so, moving on. The mental toughness framework, that 4Cs framework, is very easy to understand. And it's elegant in its simplicity in one way, but it's also moderately complex. Because the one thing we know is, and some of you have completed the questionnaire, all of you could have the same level of mental toughness, but when you look at the 4Cs, your profiles would all be totally different. So it might be overall same level of mental toughness, and the evidence is actually most of you are. But you are all individuals and you're all different. So, when we talk about the challenges of developing people, one of the things we need to do is we need to understand that difference. If you are one type of person and you're another, then there's no point doing a one-size-fits-all approach. We might miss both sets of needs. With a questionnaire, with a mental toughness questionnaire, which is probably, in my view, one of the most important developments in all of this, we are able to assess your mental toughness and assess it in terms of those 4 components. So what we're able to do is to understand others when we use it with other people, but importantly, we can understand ourselves better. Now, how many people here have completed the questionnaire? So you've all had your reports, and hopefully you'll have had a chance to look at them. And after Peter's presentation, hopefully you now understand them a little bit better. I'm going to show you before the end of this, my little spot, what the group profile looks like. But measurement is important for another reason, because if we start off with an understanding what we're like, or what our pupils are like, or what our staff are like, and then we want to do something, we want to be able to see, did we make a difference? So a reliable, valid psychometric measure, which is normative, which is what Peter was talking about, enables us to do that. And that is a big part of our work, especially in the world of business. In the world of business, people always want to know, well, if you've done this, did it make a difference? And sometimes it's in terms of performance, but sometimes it's in terms of, did you change the mindset? Because we want to see a different culture in this organisation. But we're seeing that a lot more in the world of education. People are beginning to understand better the connection between culture, mindset, and the outcomes, like mental health, performance, and so on. So we need to be able to monitor progress and monitor change. And then finally, there's evaluation. Whenever we measure something and understand something better, we're actually entering the process of learning. We're learning something about the people we work with, the pupils we work with, and if we think about it, we reflect on it, we are beginning to learn something that's quite important. Then, one of the things that has been critically important for our business and really for our relationship with Peter is that we evidence every single thing we do. So for instance, last week we met with Peter and some of his research colleagues, some of them here, and we handed over 40,000 pieces of data, about 40,000 pupils in schools. Now think about what that enables us to do. You know, all the hypotheses that fly around in the world of education or in any other world, we're able to test it out. And that's important because there's a lot of myth and so on flying around, well, in every world. So, we have developed the Mental Toughness Questionnaire. As you know, it's a 48-item questionnaire. It doesn't take terribly long to complete, roughly 8 to 10 minutes. And at the moment, we're able to assess the 4 C's. We're able to assess the extent to which you believe you're in control of your life and your emotions, commitment, the extent to which you're goal-orientated, challenge, the extent to which you're open to learning. And I think in your world, my view is that's probably the most important quality. We see a big correlation between challenge scores and openness to learning. We first came across that in the world of business when we started to use the test with training programs. We found that people with low challenge scores would enter training programs with a closed mindset. They didn't really want to learn, they didn't want to be there. People with high challenge scores thought, this is great, I'm really going to get something out of it, I'm going to put an effort into it. And whatever happens, I'm determined to learn. And then we can measure confidence. At the moment, and this is about to change, we can also assess life control, emotional control, confidence in abilities, and interpersonal confidence. Those subscales, by the way, correspond to what psychologists call self-efficacy. So those subscales are quite important. It was the reason why they were the first subscales to be developed. The other subscales we are now able to assess. We're just completing the final piece of research to enable the mental toughness questionnaire to expand to pick up all of those subscales. And that will be quite a very, very big and important development in all of this. Why is it important? Well, Steve will talk more about that later. Half of our work is in education is with students and pupils, half of it is with staff. And what we're beginning to understand, it's important to start with staff first. If you aren't developing the mental toughness of the staff, you will find it really hard to develop the mental toughness of students. We will talk a little bit perhaps more detail about that. But what we see very clearly now in all the research papers is there's a strong correlation with attainment. In other words, exam performance. There's a very strong correlation with well-being. There is a very close relationship with classroom behaviour. There's a very close relationship with attendance, with aspirations. Again, Steve is directly involved in the Blackpool Challenge project, which is all about aspirations. I believe that in Blackpool, only 3% of young people go on to college or FE or HE. We're working on a 5-year programme to raise that, using mental toughness. It's an almost entirely mental toughness-based programme. We know that the mentally tough build peer relationships better than the mentally sensitive. It's not difficult to work out why. And of course, Peter spoke about bullying. All of those issues lie at the heart of nearly all of your work. And then when you look at staff, the same applies. It's about performance, retention, well-being, morale, and personal growth. Those of you who are familiar with the work of Maslow will know that Maslow believed that the most powerful motivator was personal growth, which he called self-actualization. Our research shows there's a very close link between the mentally tough and those who are motivated in that way. A tiny bit of technical data is a normative measure. That simply means that what we did, and it takes a long time to do it took 8 years to do this, is you establish a norm. This is what the typical average person on the planet looks like. And every time you test somebody, or somebody completes the test, their results are compared against that norm. Which means you have a universal standard norm. There are other kinds of psychometrics, you're probably familiar with them, like Myers-Briggs. They're ipsative tests. But those are tests that really look at your opinion of yourself. So everybody uses their personal norm. So you can't really compare individuals. But with this, we can compare people with people reliably. The questionnaire is designed to generate 5 sets of reports. There's an individual report that contains development suggestions. There's a coaching report for pastoral care staff or teachers. There is a group report, and I'll be showing you some examples of group reports. And there is a distance travelled report. There's also what we call an assessment report, which for every single one of those scales in the questionnaire you've completed, we generate 8 sample interview questions, which you can either ask somebody else or ask yourself to help you to understand your score better. And the whole thing enables us to do individual and group analysis in lots of interesting ways, by year group, by gender, and we'll show you a couple of really interesting analyses. And above all, it's really easy to use. The questionnaire and all the reports have been written to a reading age of 10. So we've been able to successfully use the mental toughness questionnaire all the way down to year 5 pupils. But we struggle making it work below that. So, as you will now know, the front page of the report contains something like this. It's called a STEM graph. It's a summary, a numerical summary of your scores. So here we've got somebody with a mental toughness score of 5. Scores of 5 and 6 are right at the centre. The average score for a person on the planet is 5.5. So this person is normally or averagely mentally tough. But look, when you look at the subscales, this is a real piece of data, by the way, something else is happening. The interpersonal scores are 2. The life control scores are 8. Now, what we know is that people who score 1, 2, 3 are generally what we'd call mentally sensitive. That's where the mentally sensitive typically are to be found. People who score 8, 9, 10 are where the truly mentally tough sit. Scores of 4 to 7, which actually covers 68% of the population, is where most of us sit. So I'm just going to give you 2 minutes, perhaps speak to the person next to you and say, what do you think this profile's telling us? What additional information, other than the basic numbers, is this telling us? So 2 minutes. Okay, can I have you back? This is not a test. What I want to illustrate is some of you will probably have worked it out, but it's not the individual scores that matter, it's the combination of scores that matters. There's a massive information sat inside there. So we can see this person has got pretty low levels of interpersonal confidence, but very high levels of emotional control. What might that mean? Well, in this particular case, we suspected, and we found out it was the case, this was somebody that won't speak out and was very good at masking their emotions. You just didn't know what was going on with the individual. You couldn't get to that person because they had totally clammed up. They got very high confidence in their abilities and low interpersonal confidence. What might that mean? The interplay is this is somebody who believed in themselves but couldn't express it. Every time they tried to speak to somebody, they might get shouted down or somebody might argue over them. So would you expect to see that person getting frustrated, that person switching off? What's important about this, and it's the magical thing about it, is it generates so much information. I'm going to show you, just making a point. Here we have 2 people who score the same level of mental toughness. Their profiles are completely different. The behaviours you'll expect from them will be different. Their emotional responses will be different. It also means if you want to help them, and that's either to develop their mental toughness or show them how to use their mental sensitivity, you've got to understand that difference. And that's really what Peter and his colleagues have cracked. Our ability to dig down to that sort of level with people. The ability to dig down to that sort of level with ourselves. I personally have found this whole thing really empowering because I've been able to use it for myself. Okay, so it provides a common language, a framework, the ability to prioritise and direct intervention, and it gives us the ability to measure progress. Here are some examples of how some of our group data has emerged. This is a study we've just done with the Independent Schools Council. We tested just over 9,000 pupils in 58 schools. And what they wanted to know was how did mental toughness, or they called it soft skills, progress through somebody's secondary career. It's knockout. What we see is average mental toughness score, a huge sample, it's a big sample, for 9,000 pupils, a year 6, before they enter secondary school, is 4.5. Now, an adult's is 5.5, so you know they're on their way to adulthood. In year 7, it drops, and it drops moderately significantly. But you might expect that because the transition effect of going from junior school to secondary school does affect some kids. But then look what happens in years 8 and 9, it plummets. It's interesting, at the end of last year, the Department of Education put out a paper about the so-called lost years, and they were talking about years 8 and 9. They didn't evidence it, it was anecdotal. We've got evidence for it. And then it begins to climb back up. But by year 13, it's only back at the same level it was at year 6. And we're learning a lot about that. Pastoral care is likely to be a lot better in junior schools than it is in secondary schools because the pupil has a very close relationship with 1 or 2 teachers. That isn't replicated in secondary schools. And the other hypothesis, well, there are a couple of hypotheses, are that it might be hormonal. The other one is that schools tend to focus on year 7 and then they tend to focus on years 10 and 11 for obvious reasons, and perhaps years 8 and 9 are the lost years. But think about if you're not developing the mindset of pupils in the years 8 and 9, you don't catch up in years 10 and 11. So that's the kind of, we're now getting schools wanting to do this just for themselves. Here's another difference though. Peter said when we look at adults, there is almost no difference in the profiles between males and females. When we look at adolescents, there is. You can see female pupils have a very distinct drop in years 8 and 9. Males don't really have that drop. It kind of fluctuates a little bit, but the trend was pretty steady. And in fact, when we look at some components of mental toughness, we've got the same data for every one of those components, the 4 C's and the subscales. When we look at confidence and abilities, it's steadily upwards, whereas for females, it dips. And it's never as high as it is for males. What we do know is that somehow between the ages of 18 and 25, females seem to close that gap. But this is the power of using good quality assessment. It's in the public domain, so we can talk about it. This is the Blackpool Challenge data. So we've got just over 4,000 pupils were tested just over a year ago, Steve? Yeah. And what we know is we don't expect young people in the UK to score 5.5 on average. Our research shows that because they're in the process of learning, their norms are slightly less. And so wherever we've tested people across the country, when we look at overall mental toughness, generally young people score around 4.1. In Blackpool, score 3.3. So it's a surprise that they don't aspire as much as people in the rest of the country. That's the power of that sort of information. Well, here's the other interesting bit. We've also tested staff in schools in Blackpool. A surprise, surprise, there's a correlation. I find fascinating that the average mental toughness score for staff on interpersonal confidence, which I would have imagined would be an absolutely key quality in education, is 5.1. That's below. You could go and test, I can't remember how many, 519. We could go and test 519 people at random on the streets of Manchester and we would expect to get a score of 5.5. You see the kind of information that's generated when you put it together with Peter's understanding of what mental toughness is about and our ability to measure it. The next bit that you're going to hear Peter from Steve, it's magical. We can do something about it. But we can only do something about it if we understand the framework and we can measure it. Here is a project. This is an organisation some of you may be familiar with. It's Kingswood, Inspiring Learning. Some schools use them for outdoor
education. Well, they take on, I think, 592 apprentices. And they've incorporated mental toughness into a lot of their programs. They've definitely built it into their own apprenticeship program. And so they've just reviewed their first year. And you can see how purposeful development of mental toughness can happen. We can measure it before and we can measure it afterwards. But this is the first time ever that they've had an apprenticeship program where they've not lost a student. So they have 0% dropout, 100% retention. So that's another application. This is the same organisation now taking it into a school and assessing students before a week-long activity programme, and then assessing them afterwards to see to what extent that activity programme could make a difference to the mindset of young people. And you can see, on average, they were able to shift the mental toughness of students from an average of 5.25 to an average of 6.25. Now, the only tricky thing with this is handing the students back to the school and saying this is what you're getting, and the school not necessarily understanding all of this, and therefore not optimising that difference. Now, this is a programme that we ran with an organisation that used to be called Teaching Leaders. It's merged and it's reformed as another organisation now. And they ran a programme for roughly 200 people to prepare them for their first appointment, first senior appointment in schools. And it was a 2-year programme, and it revolved around, well, several themes, but one of those was mental toughness development. We did a 1-day workshop, which they all attended, and they had coaches, and we trained the coaches to understand and develop mental toughness. On the left-hand side, you can see at the start the overall mental toughness for these teachers with potential was 5.94. At the end, it was 6.99, over 2 years. Now, that's quite an impressive difference. They were able to correlate it with better attainment in the schools, shifts in exam performance, but the biggest difference was with staff morale. But of course, staff morale was spin off to a whole host of other benefits. Now, I'm just going to ask you to just dwell for a minute and look at that, the before column, because overall mental toughness 5.94. The highest scores are around commitment, 6.47. That really is impressive. And life control, 6.09. That's telling you that these are people who really believe they can make a difference. This is about their self-efficacy. Lowest scores, again, are interpersonal confidence and emotional control. You just hold that in your head for a moment. By 5 o'clock last night, 90 of you had completed the mental toughness questionnaire, so we printed off a group report. The average score of mental toughness for people who completed the questionnaire last night, that's most of you in here, is 5.92. It's almost identical to that Teaching Leaders programme. The two lowest scores are interpersonal confidence and emotional control, exactly the same as the Teaching Leaders programme. The two highest scores are commitment and life control, exactly the same as the Teaching Leaders programme. Every time we work with groups of staff in the world of education, we get exactly the same patterns. So, that is capable of development, as you can see from the Teaching Leaders programme. My hypothesis is you've got, when we've examined interpersonal confidence, that's often been a factor in dealing with unruly pupils, but most commonly in dealing with parents. That's a bigger element of an educator's job these days. My parents doff their caps to teachers. They put teachers on a pedestal. I doubt if you've got many parents who do that anymore. But
the commitment and life control scores are always higher. You don't get people entering this profession who don't believe they can make a difference. And that may be enough, but for some people it won't be enough. You can see where the development needs lie. And again, this is increasingly being picked up. And we can see that I'm just focusing for a minute on interpersonal confidence, which is one of the lowest profiles. You can see what the profile of the scores were. The highest, then the best pattern of responses was commitment. And you can see in this room, what you've got is a very committed group of people. But what we're beginning to see is the importance of understanding what our mindset, how we think, and what that means for our behaviour and for our emotional responses, and in turn what that means for our behaviour, our performance and our well-being. What Peter has been working on, and we didn't quite understand this to start with, is really quite fundamental. When he was described as distinguished at the beginning, he tends to get pretty shy about it, but he's becoming world famous for this work now. So we think, whether you're working with staff or working with pupils, or ideally both, this is absolutely critical. Now, can we develop mental toughness? Well, those of you who've booked to listen to Steve are going to find out exactly how we do it, and it really does work. And there are two options. You can actually change the mental toughness of people, if they want to, must want to, or you can show the mentally sensitive how to deal more effectively with the world. They don't have to change. We're not assigning good or bad to mental toughness or mental weakness. In fact, people with very high mental toughness scores can have significant weaknesses. They can be too tough. And then, not really selling this, but Peter and I have written 2 books, Developing Mental Toughness on the left. We have a few copies in the foyer, and if we can persuade Peter to come to the desk, he might sign those on his last day. We've got a few copies of Developing Mental Toughness in Young People, and the most recent book is Developing Employability in Enterprise, and that's of particular interest in secondary education. That's all about getting people to understand how to think about their employability and career development. All of these are based on the notion of mental toughness. And with a bit of luck,
12 minutes left.
I've got 12 minutes left. Right. So, I've got 12 minutes left. You can either have an early break, yeah, or if anybody's got any questions, I'm quite happy to take them.
Can we do
Go,
the test?
right.
I didn't do the test. Can we do it today? Or?
Yes, if you speak to Tony on the desk. Is Tony here?
Yeah, she's at the front.
Right.
Sort of
Right.
She's just keeping an eye on all the, she's out there with all the stuff.
Yeah.
Similarly, I didn't print mine off. Is there and the link is now expired. Is there a facility to get our test results?
Yeah, just speak to Tony again on the desk and she will enable the link for it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Anyone else? Oh, right, go on.
When you had that chart and you had 198 participants and then the data was 160
Yeah.
participants, you got 38 who weren't there. Now, couldn't that have an impact on what you were then looking
Yeah.
for the data?
Yes,
Was
it
it like
could.
certain people would drop out?
Yeah, there weren't dropouts, we just couldn't get them. Because
Can you know that they were a distributed bundle from which, do you know what I mean?
yes,
I can see
I
it
know what
correlation.
you mean, but the samples are still big enough and close enough
For it to be
for us to be able to say, well, actually, there's a difference.
Yeah.
We do have the data for the comparison of the 162 and 162. It's the same
Yeah.
data. Yeah. But the important thing about that is it's possible to develop mental toughness, but you have to start with understanding what it is. And one of the things that Peter and I found, we were doing some work in the school in Nursery, and we were working on the Year 10 group. And what they were looking at seeing if they could improve GCSE performance. So we tested a group of pupils, 240 pupils, and in the middle of this programme, the teachers assessed a group of young people as having low confidence and sent them off on a weekend canoeing event in the Lake District with a view to boosting their confidence. And they came back, their performance in school actually plummeted. So we looked at the data for these pupils, and what we found, because we tested them beforehand but hadn't shared that information, those kids actually had high confidence. Their commitment and challenge scores were low. So quite inadvertently, there's almost a default assessment, and this happens in business. People always talk about, oh, he hasn't got enough confidence, or she hasn't got enough confidence. It isn't about confidence, it's about those 4 components. And it's so easy to just say it's always confidence. And yet, if we misdiagnose, we do what doctors do. And if they're misdiagnosed, you don't get better. If you misdiagnose the pupil or the staff, you're not going to improve anything. We learned a big lesson from that little exercise. It was perfectly possible to use that outdoor experiential event and focus it on challenge and commitment and not on confidence. But because everybody thought it's confidence, that's what they did. Any more questions? Well, you're probably gasping for an early break. So